Hello and welcome back to the Pondering Papaya podcast for your review of the Japanese Grand Prix. Joining me to recap all the action from Suzuka are F1 journalists Ed Spencer and Yasmin Janahi. So let's get straight into it. So joining me now, as promised, is Yasmin and Ed. Thanks to both of you for joining me. What did you make of the race, Yaz? If we come to you first, what was your overall thoughts? What was your feelings about it?
Overall, I think a lot happened, but a lot didn't at the same time. I feel like we had that red flag really early on, and I feel like the race felt so much longer because we were waiting, and I'm not a morning person, so I was a bit tired. But mainly McLaren had kind of a disappointing race. Again, they had Lando qualified P3 and Oscar in P6, but to kind of have a poor race, to have P5 and P8, they just seem to not get the strategy down, and especially Daniel Ricciardo as well. He really has to kind of prove himself at the moment, and to kind of have that racing incident with Albon wasn't a good look for him either. So overall, a kind of mid-race, not too much happened, but a lot of overtakes. But hopefully next race in China will be maybe a bit more exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you entirely about. I thought there was a lot of overtakes, but then at the same time, I was like, well, they didn't really mean anything. We're just sort of seeing P9 and P8 sort of go. Ed, what did you make of it? I mean, obviously, as Yasmin mentioned, it was an early start straight into a red flag, which is not what you want really. But after we got going again, sort of what were your overall takeaways?
I think we all expected that Verstappen and Perez would run away with it, and they duly did. So nothing really surprising about it. It was an okay race. It's not one I will be watching on F1 TV in 10 years with a bucket of popcorn at 1 a.m. It was better than average, I would say, and that's saying something for 2024. For McLaren, it was just one of those days where you're damned if you do, damned if you don't with the strategy. The strategy looked good on paper, but of course the results don't never lie. And for Lando, it was disappointing to fall back to P5 after running really well in P3 and looked steady, but Ferrari just got the strategy just a little bit better. And for Oscar, I think he'll feel like he will be kicking himself for that mistake at the Degner. I think that what really ruined his momentum. And yeah, he will be also wondering why, George was able to steam down the inside of him. Ricciardo, of course, as Yaz mentioned, just the weekend from hell, really, a really unlucky weekend from, not having any practice time on Friday to missing out on Q3 and then the race being planted into the barrier with Albon. So he has a lot to think about going into China.
Yeah, I mean, we'll touch on Ricciardo a bit later. Let's get into the McLaren boys then. Let's start with Lando. Why not? Like you said, started P3, had a very good Saturday. I mean, McLaren obviously looked probably the second quickest team on the Saturday ahead of Ferrari. Ended at P5, which is obviously still a good score of points, and if we consider where they were this time last year, still obviously much better. But I think you're both right. You both summed up, but it felt a little bit disappointing. So I'll sort of run you through Lando's race. So obviously stopped in the second lap as everyone did for the red flag, but when he came back out, he pitted in the lap 1, so went from the medium to the hards, and then he came back in lap 26, hards onto a new set of hards. And I think Lando's main issue, Jasmine, if I come to you on this one, his main issue was, I think he believes the team went quite early with the strategies, and I did want to highlight that obviously eventually he got overtaken by Sainz, and Sainz pitted 4 laps later initially, but then he was 10 laps later in that second/third stint. So do you sort of agree that with Norris that maybe they were a bit too cautious, maybe they were a bit too worried about Russell back, and they should have perhaps had a bit more faith, a bit more confidence they could have got past Russell anyway, and sort of that was their best chance of a podium?
I think in the scheme of things, losing, kind of not trying to get that undercut on Russell would have really benefited. I think he could have been in the battle more for it to go up the grid. I think it's really disappointing how McLaren really kind of honed in on that fact of let's get the undercut. I think because of their pace that they were trying to do everything they could to get Lando up the grid, but it just didn't really work out for them in the end, and it's a shame. But I think now that they can look back and learn for the next race, again, it's kind of all a big learning experience, and it's not like they're at the bottom of the grid. They're still way, way, way better than they were last season and even the season before that as well. So yeah, overall disappointing, but McLaren, I feel like, are always very good, especially when it comes to strategy. If something doesn't work, they're good at analysing it and going forward with it to the next race and going, okay, we know that didn't work. We can learn something from this and bring it to the next race. So overall, I know it's just disappointing because I really do think Lando could have been up and even on the podium. So it's just a shame, but Ferrari just had that upper hand. For strategy as well, Ferrari doing well at strategy is
Yeah,
quite
Ferrari and good
surprising.
strategy in the same sentence is not something we've said a lot over the last couple of years or last decade or whatever you want to be. It's been a long time. Ed, do you think that, say, if it worked out differently, do you think McLaren would have had the pace to sort of catch up Ferrari, or do you just think there was something different between quali and the race day that Ferrari just looked a little bit quicker for whatever reason?
I think really Lando had the pace to, really go toe to toe with Ferrari, but I think we underestimated how good Leclerc's stint was before he made his stop, and how Sainz really charged in the second part of the race. So it would have been tough, don't get me wrong, because obviously, Ferrari have got a winning car now, and McLaren, is still there, but they're not quite, second the constructors at the moment. So it was.
Ooh.
I think he would have got in with a chance, but it would have not been easy. So it's a case of what if, really. I think, McLaren strategy has never really been terrible in the sense. It's always been fairly good. So I think they'll look into it and they'll say, okay, this is what we did wrong. How do we make sure it doesn't happen again in China? And, hopefully they'll rectify the mistake. So I think it was just, unlucky for him, but I think he had circumstances around him which unfortunately made sure the podium wasn't possible.
If we move on to Oscar, then obviously a bit more of a disappointing race than Norris. I mean, if Norris has been disappointed with P5, we can only imagine what Oscar's going to be like. Ends PA, and Yasmin, did you think? I don't know about this. It's probably quite harsh because he's granted he's only his second year, but it seemed like an uncharacteristically. I'm trying to think of the opposite word of smooth. Like, you know what I mean? Sort of, it was very tetchy. We saw a few mistakes, and he obviously wasn't the only driver that made a mistake. Leclerc went off at one point. I mean, obviously Sargent went off at the end of there, kind of thing. But do you agree with it? Sort of, it was not like Piastri. Usually Piastri's a very smooth driver. He seems very confident. Yet this time he seemed, for whatever reason, to make a couple mistakes here and there, which, as Ed mentioned earlier in the show, like did really cost him.
Yeah, no, I agree. We see Oscar as kind of not a rookie anymore. At least I do. He's just so impressive, like straight off the bat, since he got into that McLaren. I think the track as a whole is a difficult one. Even looking at it, it's like one of those tracks that drivers either love it or they kind of not hate it because again, it's such a fun track to drive, but it's unforgiving. If you make a mistake, you're definitely going to lose time and lose position. And I think mixed in with a bit of bad luck, especially with that incident with Russell, it just wasn't Oscar's day and he just couldn't kind of make that time up. And again, with strategy as well, it just all kind of fell apart for him, which is a shame. But P8, he's still in the points, so still something to take home for the constructors, but definitely not the weekend he would have wanted this season.
Yeah, you're right. I think you made some good point there, saying that he's still in the points. Obviously, I think we've all got a higher bar, not just for Oscar, but McLaren this year, haven't we? Because I'm thinking about Mercedes. Obviously, they would probably kill for the kind of results that McLaren were getting this year. Like, I think, yeah, Stella said it quite well. Obviously, team principal Stella said he just ultimately thought there wasn't enough pace. Like, that was their best chance doing that free stop approach kind of thing. And I think it was quite interesting. He also said it was a good reflection of their competitiveness at this stage of the season. And bringing that, I want to sort of bring in the constructors table because obviously we've now 4 races. We've got quite a lot of data, quite a lot of races to sort of look back on. There is now starting to become little sort of islands of teams. So you got Red Bull up ahead on 141, a little bit of a gap to Ferrari 120, and then you've got quite a sizable gap down to McLaren on 69, and then another quite a sizable gap down to Mercedes on 34. So McLaren really becoming sort of that third best team by quite a distance, really. Mercedes obviously have got their own problems. Ed, do you think this is a pattern that's going to continue? I mean, obviously, we haven't had a load of upgrades from any kind of team, really, because it's sort of they don't tend to do it at these flyaway races for obvious reasons. I suspect when we get to the European section of the calendar, we're going to start seeing more and more teams bring upgrades. Do you think McLaren will have enough upgrades, enough improvement in the bank to sort of crack into that top 2, or do you think we're getting to a stage already where it looks like Ferrari and Red Bull are going to be a long way down the circuit before McLaren, really?
It's tricky to say because obviously an upgrade package at any part of the season can turn things around. Look at last year, for example. McLaren were right at the bottom coming into the European season, and by Silverstone, suddenly they're fighting for potential victories. So it's not impossible that they can challenge the top two, but I think Ferrari is starting to get a little bit away from them. Red Bull, of course, are in another planet, but McLaren can be satisfied with the fact that they are now P3 in the constructors and they're not where they were last year. And it shows the good work that Andrea Stella and his team have done with this car and also with the driver lineup. However, do I think they can potentially, get to P2? I think it's going to be very, very tough. But obviously, there's teams, around them who are in much more difficult situations. Mercedes and Aston Martin are a prime example.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, you're right. That if anyone's listened to our preview of the season, really, I said McLaren for P2. So I'm still got hope. Still can possibly happen. We'll look at the drivers' standings, and I think it's quite an interesting one, really. Like the McLaren drivers are two of the closest ones. I'm going to say that in like air quotes because Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc split by just 4 points, but obviously Sainz missed out a race, so not as even as we might suspect. But if I just run you through it, so obviously no surprise who's up top. Max Verstappen on 77 points, Sergio Perez is in second on 64. Then you got Leclerc and Sainz, so Leclerc in third on 59, Sainz 55, and then you've got the McLaren drivers again who sort of in a no man's land of their own, really. Like Lando Norris on 37 and Oscar Piastri on 32. Russell a little bit down on 24. And speaking of Russell, I wanted to sort of touch on this incident between him and Piastri late in the race. I mean, for those who maybe didn't see it, I mean, he was trailing. Piastri had quite a good run on him. Piastri made a mistake that we sort of mentioned, and Russell was catching. And then it wasn't so much as a dive bomb. I don't know what a less harsh version of a dive bomb is, but whatever that is sort of what he did. He went in and Piastri felt like he had to sort of avoid any kind of contact, took the slip road, and he still kept the lead. Obviously lost it a little bit later on. Yasmin, the stewards sort of gave him a pass and sort of said the racing incident. Do you agree with that assessment, or do you think there should have been a bit more punishment for essentially forcing another driver off the track?
I think the stewards have been harsher before for incidents like this. I think they're, this is the FIA. They kind of flip-flop between rules and whether they're going to give people a penalty or not. But I've looked at all the onboards, and I think it definitely, if someone was to be at fault, it was Russell's fault. Again, he kind of really snuck in that apex and went wide, which is what made Oscar have to cut that corner. But it was kind of more on a racing incident. It was a really fine line. It's not really clear cut that he was in the wrong. But yeah, I've definitely seen drivers before get caught for this, and the FIA just choose today. No, I don't think so.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we can all agree that if it's the other way around, I mean, Russell absolutely loves a moan, doesn't he? Like he would be the first one on the radio saying that should be a penalty. But it was interesting if you read the stewards' notes that McLaren sort of agreed that it wasn't a penalty. Whether that's like a tactical thing, they think maybe if we do it now, we can sort of set precedent for the future. Ed, are you agreed that sort of it was I don't know what if you were the steward, would you have given a penalty for that?
Well, first off, I find it ironic that 35 years ago, McLaren was involved in an incident at that same corner, and that was a racing incident, but they didn't give it, of course. For me, it was it was a racing incident. It's simple: two cars going into a very tight corner, fighting for position with only a handful of laps to go. You're gonna get them squeezed out, and for me, it was more 55-45 Russell because he made the slightest little bit of contact, not mass loads. It didn't put a massive hole in Oscar's side pod, but it was more on him. But yeah, I kind of think it was a racing incident. But as Yaz has said, stewards have been a lot harsher, in the past on incidents that have been very similar to this. So again, you have to look at the consistencies of the stewarding and whether it is the right call to have, a team of stewards which is rotated every race. We kind of need those consistent stewarding. Consistent team of stewards if we want better decisions on track.
Yeah, of course. Johnny Herbert was part of the Australian team, but it wasn't here this time. So I think Fernando Alonso made a joke, didn't they? He could slow up as much as he liked because Johnny Herbert wasn't around. But yeah, if we sort of, I mean, obviously it's the first time we've had both of you on the show. What have you made? Because like I said, we've had 4 races now. We're a fair way into the season. What, Yasmin, have you made of the McLaren season? Obviously, it's hard to compare really because we're sort of taking it from last year when they were so bad. But if we look a bit like broader in terms of sort of who McLaren are, like their history kind of thing, good season, bad season. What are you saying so far?
Overall, I think it's a good start. It's a good starting point. They're in the points pretty much every weekend. And again, try not to the years that they've had recently, it's a big improvement. And I do only think that they're going to go up. And we saw that video that they kind of released at this just before preseason testing, that this is their year. They're really going to push for points, push for wins. And I do think that's going to come very soon, whether this year or not. But I think McLaren just continue to improve, and I have high hopes for them. I'm very optimistic, and we haven't seen them go back to where they were at the start of last season. They do keep improving, and hopefully they do keep it up. And I hope to see Lando or Oscar have a win this season. I don't know if you two think a win is on the table. Again, we have Max Verstappen, who I think this race did 13 seconds ahead of everyone. So maybe we might have a DNF somewhere again for Max, and we might see them back up there, but we'll see.
That's sort of the era we're in, aren't we? Like, I think in any other time, I mean, it's harsh because you do get a lot of like very strong drivers. I'm thinking obviously Hamilton before, but you'd think that someone like Norris, the talent, would have had a few wins by now if he didn't have someone called Max Verstappen about half a second down, half a minute, down the road. Ed, what about you? If I had to put you on the spot and say, does Lando get a win this year, or Oscar? I mean, obviously Oscar's got that sprint victory, but does he get a full Grand Prix victory? Can you see McLaren winning races at some point this year?
That's very tough. I think every team is wondering whether they can win a race this year. As Yaz has implied, you kind of need Max to retire or Checo to not have a good race for a team from outside Red Bull to get on top. I think they have the talent to do it. I think they have the potential to do it. I think they have, on the day of the cut, McLaren is very good, but it's every team is playing catch up to Red Bull, so it's going to be very, very tricky. But of course, we have races where the conditions turn on their heads, or we have races which are red flagged, and of course we have strategy come into it. So it's not impossible, but I do think it's going to be very, very tricky. Maybe a sprint for one of the two, but at the end of the day, I think this is really Red Bull's season to lose.
Yeah, and of course we've got a sprint coming up. We're going to be our first sprint of the year. I mean, it's slightly, I don't know, not a bogey skin or a banana skin, whatever, but we're going back to China, obviously. Poor Oscar, who's had a whole year, a lot of tracks he's never driven on. He's now probably got another track that he certainly hasn't driven on in F1. I'm struggling. I presume Norris has. I should have checked this before we go on. I'm going to presume that Norris has done. Yeah,
2019.
Yeah, so yeah, even he's got some experience. But yeah, interesting sprint race. We could see something a little bit different. If we sort of take a wider look at the grid of the race, sort of what occurred. Really, obviously another win for Max. Like, we'll gloss over that because there's not a lot to talk about really, because he was miles down the road. We were speaking about racing incidents. Let's go back to the very first lap. Ricciardo and Albon. I mean, it was quite a hectic start for those drivers, wasn't it? There was a lot of dodging and weaving. I mean, I think the common thing that's said is Ricciardo was looking out for Stroll. Like, Yasmin, what do you reckon? Was that Ricciardo's fault, Albon's fault, racing incident? Where you drawing the line on that one?
Oh, I think it's a racing incident, to be honest. Those cars just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the tracks don't get any bigger. They stay the same. And to see them all squeeze through that corner, and I think it was really unfortunate. Just Ricciardo was looking to his left, trying to avoid, I think it was Lance Stroll that was coming up the inside, and just didn't see Albon behind him, and it just caused that collision. And it's really disappointing because Daniel really does need to improve. There's rumours about Liam Lawson replacing him, and I think the cameramen this season, this race, definitely knew what they were doing. They were kind of panning to Daniel and panning to Liam in the garage, trying to suggest, Liam's right there, Liam's right behind. And I do think that Daniel needs to prove himself next race, that all this experience, all this kind of hype around him is there for a reason, and that he can still perform. But also disappointing for Alex, and especially Williams and their chassis. I think like the past couple of races, they just had big shunt after big shunt, and they just are scrambling to get a chassis together to try and keep up with all these incidents. So also very disappointing for Williams as well.
Yeah, you're right to point out that chassis. Obviously, we had all that drama in Australia, and James Vowles before this race said they weren't going to have a spare till Miami, I think it was. So yeah, I think everyone in Grove's got all their fingers crossed that Alex is fine. Obviously, Sargent as well had a bit of an issue later on, but his was less severe. Ed, coming to you on Ricardo, because obviously, as Yasmin mentioned, it can be quite harsh being an F1 driver because the nature of your role means that often you know who your replacement's going to be. Like they're hanging around the paddock, and it's something that he's familiar with because he was doing this last year, sort of hanging over what we thought was Perez, but ended up being Nick De Vries in the end. But like, how many races do you think he can go on like this? Where I mean, it's not like he's driving badly, but he's just not driving well, is he? Like he's not setting the world on fire. He's not really impressing that much. Like, what's your prediction for the future of Ricardo? Really?
I don't think we can press the panic buttons just yet. I think we are 4 races in, and he's had a fair share of bad luck. This weekend was probably his unluckiest because, as I mentioned earlier, he didn't have any free practice time because Iwasa was in the car for FP1 and then FP2 was rained out. Quali just missed out on Q3 and really probably had the pace to get in, but as we know, it's fine margins in quali and you've got to be perfect on every part of the track. With the race, it's very much a case of these cars are very wide, they're probably a bit too wide. So the S's is one of the trickiest parts of the Suzuka circuit, and on that one it's a bit like a supermarket car park on a Sunday morning. Everyone's trying to get the right position and no one's going to yield, and for Daniel it was unfortunately, Alex just came in and off they both went. I think Red Bull are going to keep an eye on it because obviously there are rumours going around that Lawson's been promised a seat for 2025 and they need to move one of the Minardi drivers out of the seat at some point. So he has to up his game. He needs to start scoring. I think once the points start coming in, the pressure can start to come off and he can start to really drive how he knows how to drive, because you don't just lose it in like 2 or 3 years. You don't suddenly become a terrible driver in like 2 or 3 years. Daniel's still a very good driver. Daniel can still do it on his day, but he needs to get on that board. And I think if he's not on the board by, I would say, Spain, then we can start saying, okay, this is getting serious now. He needs to up his game or Lawson is going to steal his drive.
I mean, that's very good point. And who hasn't shunted an old lady in a car park on a Sunday? I mean, it's natural. We've all done it. Let's not lie. I want to quickly go before we go into another former McLaren driver, I should say. Just a quick word for Yuki, because obviously it's his home race, first Japanese driver to score in over a decade. Like, Yasmin, he's a driver that I've often sort of championed. I wrote a story for Planet F1 on Saturday about he should be seen as more than just someone to make Honda happy, really, which obviously gets thrown out along a lot. Like, what did you make of him, both in this race and sort of as a season overall?
I think he's done really well to be outperforming your teammate, and not just by like half a second, by seconds. And he's just so impressive at the minute, and I'm really happy because I feel like Yuki's kind of been seen as this driver who just swears and gets angry all the time and loses his cool, but he's matured a lot with Racing Bulls once AlphaTauri, and it's great to see him finally kind of get that respect and to be again the first Japanese driver to get in the points since Kobayashi in 2012. Yeah, he came third in 2012. It's been really, really impressive, and kind of Japan and Japanese fans and fans all around the grid are getting really hyped about it, and it's good to see him kind of step up, because probably a year back I would have thought Yuki's going to maybe lose his seat eventually, but I don't really think that anymore. I think he's kind of in that driver market, whether he has his contract extended next year with Racing Bulls or he goes elsewhere. Either way, I think he'll be on the grid for a lot longer.
Yeah, you're right. He's done a fantastic job. And yeah, the Japanese fans are just so good, aren't they? I mean, I presume everyone saw that Aston Martin / Red Bull fan who whipped off the Red Bull clothes and Aston Martin fan. He was absolute favourite. What a superstar. I want to move on to another McLaren man. And obviously, we said how well Tsunoda's been doing. But obviously, I think this man's... It's hard to say he's been the best on the grid because obviously Max Verstappen exists. But he's surprised the most, let's say. I mean, that's obviously Carlos Sainz. Ed, just another great race for him today, wasn't it? I mean, I think something that's come to like characterize Sainz maybe since he left McLaren, but obviously a few years into Ferrari, it's just how mature a driver he is. He doesn't seem phased by anything really. And like we're talking about the changes and sort of when people came into pit, as we were talking about McLaren, but Sainz was the last man standing of that front group, wasn't he? He didn't come in until very late on, but he wasn't fussed at all, and he just quickly cut his way through the field to a very deserved podium. Like, what did you make of his race in Suzuka?
I thought he drove very well, as he did in Melbourne. Obviously, he didn't have, he didn't have the pace to fight Red Bull again, but that's understandable. And he drove a very solid, mature race, didn't put a foot wrong, went long on the tyres, and it paid off. And I think it's been really, the sign that Carlos has got that fire in his belly. He knows full well that he is in the shop window for this year, and he wants to tell every team that, hey, I'm free, I can do this job as a number 2 or even a number 1 driver if you need it. And he's doing extremely well. I think this is a Carlos Sainz which has really become a more better, more dominant, more mature driver since, I would say, he got pole at Monza in 2023. We all knew the potential was there, but he was missing something. There was something not quite there. Ever since that race, he's become a different driver, and he's become so good at what he's done. I think he's done tremendously well this year, and particularly after having an appendicitis and then coming back 16 days later to win what is his 3rd Grand Prix, which feels mental because he's been around forever. So yeah, kudos to Carlos. Another great performance, another podium. Happy days for him.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, still the only non-Red Bull man to win a race in like what seems like a decade now. But let's end this podcast with sort of let's do a full recap of all the former McLaren men, shall we? And Yasmin, let's come to Lewis Hamilton, which is obviously a former McLaren man a long time ago now, but his worst start to his season after 4 races, just the 10 points so far. I mean, he looked or sounded, as it were, a completely dejected man, didn't he, in the race? So, like, he was sort of arguing with Bono about his strategy and about the speed. Where does this relationship go? Because obviously we all know he's moving to Ferrari. I did hear he got asked some questions about that, and he very much shut them down. He wasn't happy to talk about Ferrari at all, really. What's going to happen between those two? Obviously, being Mercedes and Hamilton going in the year ahead. Do you reckon?
I don't think Lewis is just gonna kind of give up and not care about Mercedes. I think people have this opinion that, oh, well, he's going to Ferrari, he's not really going to care about his results this season or the team as a whole. And I don't think that's in Hamilton's character, especially a team he's been with for, my God, so long now. But I do think he just wants out. I think he just wants out. I think he's ready for Ferrari, and he's ready for that change. And who knows, it might be a positive change for him, or it could all kind of go wrong again for him. But I think that Lewis has definitely left his mark on Mercedes, and I know probably Toto is still very upset that he's leaving, but Lewis has kind of built that team up with Toto, and I think that Mercedes will eventually, whether it's next season or a couple more seasons, get a car that's competitive again. Toto was saying that they're basically just doing live testing, like every race, every free practice, because they just don't know how to kind of get this car back to the top. But we'll see. Hopefully it will improve. But I think the relationship is kind of over. I think they're more like not like a happy kind of marriage anymore. They're kind of more separated. We're civil, but I want out of
still
the
living
marriage.
together, but you're going to get your own flat soon, kind of thing. Definitely that kind of vibe for sure. I like that analogy. That's very good. Yeah, I mean that will do for today's podcast. I mean, I was going to quickly get a very early prediction from perhaps you, Ed, about China. Obviously, a track with a lot of good long straights, which you maybe think McLaren might do well at. But what's your sort of very early prediction of how McLaren could do there?
I think it's going to be it's really their best chance for a win, because no one's going to be going in with any relevant data. We've got sprint weekend, so there's limited practice time. Obviously, the key will be to get Oscar up to speed before the sprint shootout, but I really do think that McLaren are going to be going into this weekend full of hope and full of aspiration to challenge Red Bull for victory. And I think at least a podium. I think that's what they will be aiming for, at least a podium, or 2, depending on how the sprint goes and how the race goes itself. So lots to look forward to from McLaren.
Very optimistic way to end it. Thank you, Ed. I like that very much. Yeah, my thanks again go to both of you for joining, especially as we've all had quite an early start. I mean, we were saying we all live in the UK, and it's a very brutal time zone to be in for these kind of races. But we can't really moan because obviously Australian people get up ridiculous hours for anything. So, but yeah, my thanks again for both of you joining. You can go enjoy a well-deserved nap. But yeah, thanks again for joining both of you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So that's it for today's episode. My thanks go to both Ed and Yasmin for joining me today, and you can find links to their work in the description of the pod. Our next episode will be an interview special, so keep an eye on your feeds for that one. But in the meantime, be sure to subscribe and follow us on social media @Pondering Papaya. Thanks for listening.